Okay. Hi there. Welcome back, or welcome. I am Sherry Lee. I'm with Architecture for Humanity. I'm Director of Strategic Development. I'm thrilled to be here. Been with the organization since the work on the Gulf Coast, so I'm honored to work with this organization. I want to first thank our sponsors, and they're there in front of you. They made this possible. Obviously, Autodesk, whose space we're in. Currystone Design Prize is hosting our lunch later. And earlier you heard a little bit about the Wholesome Awards, and here are others, Dwell and the rest. So we're going to go into population shocks. I'm really excited about this panel. Actually watched a couple documentaries after we found out we were going to do this panel, so I'm really psyched to hear about it. Our moderator is our very own T. Luke Young, who is feverishly writing notes at the last minute. Oh, questions, still last minute, I would say. So I'm going to call him up. He is ready, right, T. Luke? Okay, so this should be great. Stick around, and then afterwards there'll be breakout sessions where you can ask our panelists more questions. So thank you guys for being here. All right.
Thanks so much, Shirley. Before I get started, I want to thank AFH for this opportunity to be here, speaking about shrinking cities and population shocks, and thank Fabiana for all her help on the team putting this together. We spent a lot of time looking into this issue and getting more depth knowledge of it, and we're all fascinated by the process. And Bridget Dodd, who has done an amazing job with this conference, and she really designed this conference like she gives a damn, and she does. So I want to just publicly thank her as well. My name's T. Luke Young, and I was born in a shrinking city. Sounds like a confession, but it is. And I hadn't realized, and we were just having a discussion with the panelists, how much of my life I've spent in what we would define as a shrinking city, but nobody called it that. No, nobody paid attention to it. Where I was born has changed probably most of our lives. It's Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, known as the home of the first steel nail, along with balloon framing that changed the U.S. and architecture worldwide. But by the time I was born, the mills had pretty much closed. Bethlehem Steel, also nearby, was closing down. So I want to talk to you today a little bit about my experience and set the stage a little bit for the panelists. And after their four brief presentations, we'll have time for some discussion and then questions from you all. And yes, I was scribbling down questions at the last minute because there are always more questions that come up that are, I think, interesting here to discuss. Upon moving around the Northeast my entire life and living in shrinking cities, or shrunken cities, I finished in a small town called Philmont, which was a former industrial town. The mills had burned down. And coming back to that town 20 years later, there's the Schermerhorn's Garage, which is where we had our car fixed, is now a slow food, organic, vegan restaurant. So my point about this small one, I want to come back to this, is this little town that everybody neglected didn't have thinkers like we have here helping to come up with solutions and strategies. It was an incremental change, an incremental reaction to a shrunken population, a loss of jobs, which is another model. I know it's a painful, long model, but it's another model that'd be interesting to discuss. In school and thereafter, we looked at the kind of quintessential, and Philmont, by the way, didn't have an airport code, so it's not on here. Looked at some of the classic cases in a course called Crisis Cities, which I took looking at Cleveland Indianapolis, specifically Detroit, Buffalo, and started to think about, traditionally in education, architecture, and urban planning, you look at the success story as the model. This is the first time I've seen a class that said, okay, let's look at these cities and how do we change these. We're not going to look at the success stories. We're going to see how we can make our own success stories. And then I had the opportunity to work in Lawrence, Massachusetts, another former industrial town. And what had happened there was Latino population had been recruited in the 70s at the same time the mills were shutting down. So there was a small population of working Dominicans and Puerto Ricans there that came at the same time that jobs left. And so there was a small population, but because it was an immigrant community, that population grew and grew and grew, and the jobs didn't come back. So we had to, working for a nonprofit there, we had to take the approach, which I think should be the approach for any project, is community-driven development. How do we build back better, as we say at Architecture for Humanity? How do we create both at the same time a more dense city, but a more sustainable city in terms of ecological values? What's interesting to me also upon speaking with the panelists and researching in my experience is we have independent, somewhat related, and we can talk more about that, phenomena in the world today. We have shrinking cities. Here we'll hear about some of them in the United States. But we have shrinking cities in Australia for the same reasons, for former mining towns, Bolivia, and other places. But we also have shrinking cities in places like Colombia, where there's a rural to urban or a small town to large town migration. So you have this phenomenon, even though the world is urbanizing, a phenomenon that urbanization itself creates population shocks in other places, in both places, and we'll talk about that. I would like to also think about, as you listen to the presenters, the idea of environmental impact. The idea of density, will be a discussion about maybe shrinking cities or population shocks in the sense of a decreased population give cities room to breathe, to rethink. Others say that no, density is the answer. We'll look at Manhattan, which is 4 times the population of Houston. This is at the same scale. And it covers about 2/3 of the area of Houston. So interesting to think about these two examples where many say Manhattan is one of the most sustainable places in the world, and say Houston, I'll be diplomatic, less so. I'm not sure who's here today, but interesting to have that discussion, and it might not be a black and white answer. In fact, I think it's probably not. And lastly, the idea of a professor at MIT who actually taught the Crisis Cities class and now has just been focusing on talks about design after decline, and we talk a lot about that here at Architecture for Humanity, and some of the panelists as well. Is there also a way to talk about designing for decline? Designing in a way that, and Stuart Brand, who came up earlier in the first panel, and there are a lot of commonalities between the two panels. It's a matter of scale, interestingly enough, between materials and cities. And we could take that up to the global or universal level if you prefer. But Stuart Brand talks about the idea of flexible architecture, low road structures, right? Structures that are sustainable because they're adaptable over time. Can we build or think about designing cities, low road cities, if you will? And that's kind of a challenge to the panelists, and it's something that I would like the opportunity to discuss here today. We have an incredible slate today of panelists from different backgrounds, and are all coming together to share their knowledge, their extensive knowledge with you. I will introduce them one by one, and they will follow that with a 5-minute presentation. Okay. First step. Phil Longman Thanks for joining us. I'm going to just give you a brief overview of Phil's experience. Phil is a senior editor of the Washington Monthly, a senior research fellow with the New America Foundation, and an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. He's written frequently on the issues of population aging and its relationship to the global trend of falling birth rates. Following publication of his 2004 book, The Empty Cradle, notice the cradle theme, overlapping panels, he has spoken widely on the subject, including in advisory roles in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the U.S. Naval War College, the Japan Foundation, and the governments of India and the Russian Federation. Thank you, Phil, for joining us. And if you can choose if you'd like to be up here or on your seat.
Okay.
Your choice.
I'll try it up here.
Okay.
Well, thank you. And my task here is to give you the history and future of world demography with a special emphasis on urbanization in the next 5 minutes. So we're going to rock and roll. Let me see if I can get it. So here's what most of us think we know about world demography, right? We're in the middle of a population bomb. World's getting ever more crowded. This reflects a projection put out not recently by the United Nations Population Division. And it shows that world population, which is now just a little bit north of 7 billion, is on its way to 10 billion during the remainder of this century. There's no particular reason to quarrel with this projection. Most of the people who are going to be alive during the course of this projection have already been born, so there's a lot of built into the cake-ness about this. But it's very deceiving, and let me show you why. So in the past, population grew because there were more children in the world, right? Going forward, population growth is of a completely different kind. Yes, we're going for 7 to 10 billion people, but almost all of that increase is in the form of more old people, which is kind of weird because it's like saying world population is going to grow because of more people who've already been born. But it's true. Now here I'm contrasting with the tan line, if you can see it, how population growth used to happen, right? It used to be overwhelmingly most of the growth in world population came from more young people. Going forward, overwhelmingly, most of the world population growth will be from more old people. Here's another way of presenting the same data. We see on the bottom the world population of children as projected by the United Nations Population Division versus the world population of people over 60. You can see where the population growth is coming from. Here's another way of looking at it the same way. We've got a gigantic age wave coming, right? And this actually is growing the population. Now, this is counterintuitive, but why is this? Basically, two reasons. One is, and this is the minor reason, people are living longer than they used to. Decreased mortality. That's part of it. The more overwhelming reason is because this boom here used to be a baby boom. And we've got baby booms around the world aging into senior booms. And as these senior booms, as these erstwhile baby booms become senior booms, they increase the density of population at these older ages and thereby increase world population. Why is this happening? Big single reason is we have this one gigantic mega trend in the world today, which is people are having fewer and fewer children. This trend started in Scandinavia in the 1970s. People didn't actually know what it was. Couldn't believe the data because we had a peaceful, prosperous population that was failing to produce enough children to even replace itself. Subreplacement fertility is what it's called. That phenomenon spread throughout Europe, spread throughout all of the Soviet Union, and today is on its way to spreading throughout the world. Now, you might ask, if the average woman has fewer children than is needed to replace the population, how is the population still growing? Right? Again, people living longer and these former baby boom waves becoming senior booms. Obviously, in the longer term, world population falls. Behind this decline in fertility are many, many factors, and we could spend all afternoon talking about this, but the one overwhelming thing that everybody can agree on is that we're living in a world now where close to half the world's population lives in cities. And when people go from living in a rural environment to living in an urban environment, the economics of childbearing completely change. So that children go from being a clear economic asset to being a challenging economic liability, or luxury consumer item, you might say, right? So part of this is not new. Cities have always been demographic black holes. They've always had more deaths and births in them. They've relied on emigration from the countryside. Part of what's happening now around the world is this decline in fertility has spread outside of cities into the countryside, so that we have, even as people move into the cities, they're moving in with fewer children to start with. Another thing that's kind of amazing is, despite many predictions about how all these smartphones and telecommunication devices that the city has done so much to bring to the world would mean the death of cities, it means no such things. In fact, we have people more and more finding that they need to live in cities in order to get ahead. But importantly, not just any cities. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to be very brief. But when it comes to cities in the world, we have a picture of two kinds of cities. One are cities like this one, that are incredibly prosperous and whose per capita income continues to pull away from that of the rest of the country and indeed the world. And more people feel like they have to live here in order to make a living. We've got venture capital firms moving from Silicon Valley to downtown San Francisco because Silicon Valley is too far away from the action, right? Despite the distance. Meanwhile, we have all kinds of other cities that are depopulating because they are on the now periphery. And this is true even within cities like New York, where you can see that the actual per capita income of the core of New York, Manhattan, is pulling away from that of the peripheries. So anyway, that's a very quick sketch in, I think, 6 minutes of world population trends, past and present and future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. The world and the future of population in 6 minutes is pretty impressive. I love the fact that it's the elderly that are growing the population. I'm still trying to get my head around that, but I'm getting there. Next, we'll lead into Nina Baird from Carnegie Mellon University. She's a researcher, educator, consultant, and soon-to-be PhD. Next time, we'll call you doctor. Which is wonderful. She currently teaches graduate courses in global green building concepts, net zero residential design, and community redevelopment at Carnegie Mellon School of Architecture. She's also a partner of AFH's on a project we're working on, sustainable building practices and integrating those into academic curricula sponsored with our partner Alcoa. So we're happy to have you here speaking with us. She's working with the National Groundwater Association and International District Energy Association on community energy systems planning. Previously, Vice President, DC consulting firm focusing on environmental health in contracts with the federal OSHA, the EPA, and the Department of Energy. Thank you, Nina.
Hi. At the risk of sounding naive, I'd like to suggest that declining populations can actually offer us benefits, and that any shock we may be feeling could actually just be the shock of change. I live in a city that has lost half its population, and the project that I'm working on that T. Luke just referred to is in a neighborhood that has lost even more than that. But I teach many international students, and I think they're really teaching me about population shock. Let's see. Many of those students live in cities where the only way to build is up, and where buildings will no longer cool down at night because the density means that air can no longer move among them. The population is growing so fast and land is so valuable that buildings are only anticipated or wanted to last for 15 years because at that point they might be torn down and something larger would be built. And the small particulate levels in many of these places are an order of magnitude higher than the World Health Organization and the EPA consider safe. Although populations continue to decline globally, and Phil's demographics I'm learning from, but I am reading the same UN reports that came out that suggest that our populations will continue to grow. As I tease my students, we don't die like we used to. And I wonder whether that concept of carrying capacity that we apply in ecology, why we don't apply it to human development, and why we are so ready to accept that megacities are our future. Because we know from environmental science and from ecology that carrying capacity is real and that species can die off when you exceed it. So although I do think declining populations pose economic and social challenges, in my view, what I'm learning from, again, students who live in very different kinds of places, is that our view of sustainability is still sustainability of abundance. We are still, when we design and model energy use in buildings, for example, we model it as though there's a set point temperature that will be maintained, whereas some of the students in my classes, and they come many times from economically advantaged backgrounds, live in places where energy and water are either on a scheduled basis or unscheduled basis shut off for entire days because there's just not enough. Or we imagine cutting potable water use where in India and China, in many places, potable water is just not delivered to buildings. People either boil or buy potable water. We imagine providing daylighting and quality views as part of our LEED system, but daylighting and quality views are really not available in a place where buildings are really close together. And I still remember feeling very myopic when I teach zero energy housing, and one of the students from South Korea said to me, yes, my dream home is a single family home, and what you're talking about is really very quaint, but I could never have something like that where I live. So I guess when I see benefits, one of the things that I think could be possible with reduced and older populations is that it gives us an opportunity to consider how we might reconfigure our cities and towns. Perhaps it's a chance for the environment to breathe a little bit and for us to again, with, let's say, an aging population, perhaps a slower consumer metabolism to reduce our carbon footprint. When I look at community and district system redevelopment, the opportunity to link our energy, water, and wastewater systems, the pipes you see there are actually sewer pipes with heat exchangers in the bottom so that you can recover the thermal energy in wastewater and deliver it to buildings for heating. So again, I see some benefits that might actually accrue in an environment where we are still in a position where we have a little bit of wiggle room as opposed to megacities. So when I was at the Curry Stone Design Awards last night, one of the awardees was saying that he thought some of the real beauty and power of design was designers' ability to design for people and for specific circumstances. So when I look at declining populations, really, I see the opportunity to address demographic and social changes with good design, and that it could be the opportunity to remake ourselves into a better, more flexible and resilient future. Thanks.
Thank you, Nina. I would love to have fill Bogota and the world with those sewer pipes. It's an incredible resource and an optimistic way to look at shrinking cities. If you're interested in Nina's work and our collaboration with Carnegie Mellon, as well as the other universities around the world, just launching a website called pillarsofsustainability.org. Definitely check it out. She's going to have research posted in a blog fashion, as well as the other universities throughout the world, and developing projects which you'll be able to see live online. So I do encourage you to check that out. Next up, we have Miljana Vojasavic from Prudential. Prudential has also been a strong partner of AFH's, specifically in Japan, and are helping us build back better in Japan. So we're very appreciative of that, and for her work here in the U.S. and coming to join us and share with us. She's a portfolio manager with the Social Investments Group of Prudential, which has been investing to support thriving communities, education, and economic opportunity for individuals and businesses since 1976. A couple years after I was born, actually, in Phoenixville. At Prudential, Miljana manages the group's portfolio of work in key urban geographies, including New Orleans and Detroit. She's also responsible for the team's charter school portfolio in Newark and throughout the United States. Miljana is currently working with the Rockefeller Foundation to develop a hyperlocal insurance model that seeks to mitigate homes so that they're more resilient in the face of future natural disasters. Miljana holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Political Science from the University of Michigan and a Master's of Arts in International Relations and Economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Welcome.
Oh, sorry, I'm dropping the waters. Does this work? Okay, thank you. So thanks for the background, so I will make this as quick as possible. Thank you for having me. So I always feel compelled to give a little bit of background because Prudential is an insurance company. We've been around since 1875, and we're based in Newark, New Jersey. Our group specifically has been around since 1976. So for anyone who's familiar with impact investing, that's what we do. And we've done $1.5 billion in investments ever since. And this is sort of a quick look at how our work is broken down. And this community vitality is really probably most relevant for this panel, and some of the examples I'll draw from here. So some of the work that we do, what I call not shrinking cities, but shrunk cities. We have a lot of work in New Orleans, so I'm not a demographer, but the current population of New Orleans is at 70% of its pre-Katrina peak. And one of the results of that is there's a dramatic increase in vacant housing with about 47,000 blighted units. And so when we enter these markets, we don't say, let's raise everything to the ground and build something brand new. We say, what can we do with what's already there? So our two major strategies in New Orleans are scattered site rehabilitation. So that's really acquiring piece by piece blighted units that look like crap, and you say, what can we do to make it pretty? And then also development along OC Haley Boulevard. So I'll give a little bit of context around those two. So I love pictures. So this is sort of a before picture of, we work with a great local developer in New Orleans, and basically what he does is he buys unit by unit, he pools together all the money, and then he redevelops them and rents it out to low-income populations. So you can see like what this looks like. So this is, can you imagine that being on your block before? And then something like that, I mean, I would live there. That's better than my apartment in Brooklyn. So we look for things like that. And, a lot of affordable housing units that you've seen in major cities, they're kind of unsightly. They take up the whole block. It concentrates poverty. This is really something that makes sense in a city like New Orleans. So that's some of the work. And this is more before and after, so you can see kind of what that looked like before and what it looks like now. And some of our other work in New Orleans is OC Haley Boulevard. So I'm not sure if anyone from New Orleans is in the room, but this is a pretty interesting area. It's right there by that red dot. It's near the Central Business District, near the Superdome. And it's one of the, the highest crime and very violent area in New Orleans. Interestingly, St. Charles Ave is where all the beautiful historical mansions are in New Orleans, but you have this kind of pocket of poverty and sort of no activity. And so it's been a focus of a lot of redevelopment work lately, and we've been working on some projects there specifically. So, for example, this is Myrtle Banks. So this actually used to be an elementary school. The roof caved in. It's, obviously a very huge building. It's blighted. Nothing's happening with it. And we're working with a developer now to turn it into this. So this is a Jack and Jake's Market. It's a local business in New Orleans. It's providing affordable, fresh food to an underserved market, green space, flexible office space for small businesses and emerging entrepreneurs. And that'll make a real difference in a place that doesn't have any of this activity. And then another project we're working on is the New Orleans Jazz Orchestra. It's kind of like Wynton Marsalis's Jazz at Lincoln Center, but they have no home. And they're going to build this building, which is the Gators discount store, into this. So you can see that all these things being adjacent to each other on this one major corridor will make a real difference. And our goal is to really turn this into a corridor where people go to after 5 p.m. So in Detroit, I think everybody's pretty familiar with Detroit. Our group says if the city goes bankrupt, let's invest there. So since 1950, the city's population has shrank from a high of 1.8 million people to 710,000. So one project that we're working on now is a $30 million debt facility to build multifamily housing along the Woodward corridor in Midtown, and that'll focus on rehabbing existing housing stock, which is what a lot of our work does. And so these are just some of the trends that kind of support why we do some of the projects that we do. So again, these aren't markets that are conducive to development or investment, but there are certain trends that we see, there's some hope there. So for example, strong anchor institutions, employment growth, you have residential incentive programs, which if you live in San Francisco or Brooklyn make you envious because you pay so much money for broker's fees and security deposits and people want you to move there. We have a new Whole Foods that opened there as well, low vacancy rate and rising rent levels, and also other private initiatives such as Dan Gilbert and Quicken Loans. So this is just a kind of quick snapshot of our work. As I said, we're really focused on rehabbing existing housing stock, working with the historic fabric of the city, and working with what's already there. Thank you.
Thank you, Miliana. We always say that the most sustainable thing you can do is reuse a building, and Miliana and Prudential are making that happen through capital investments. It's interesting also in the field, more and more we're realizing, and it's taken us a while, these guys are the key to making what we see happen and what the community needs to happen. Without capital markets, without investment, our impact can only be at such a scale. This is what Yana was talking about, and Rob will talk about, is really bringing it up to scale and making a huge impact. Thank you. Next, I'd like to present Rob Blumker, CEO and founder of 510 Capital. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I've learned a lot from you in the short amount of time we've been discussing this panel. 510 is an investment firm acquiring, renovating, and leasing foreclosed single-family homes across the country. Rob has 25 years' experience in financial markets, beginning on Wall Street, trading mortgages for the Salomon Brothers, and now is dedicating his life and career to finding ways to build and rehabilitate cities and really creating, I think, equitable spaces and opportunities for those that didn't have them before in areas of investment that Prudential, but not too many others are willing to dive into. So I appreciate that. Welcome.
Thank you. So I came about this a bit different, and the population shock that we're dealing with is more of people going from ownership to renting. And it's not necessarily people moving as much from neighborhoods, but it's amazing how many people are going to move from one house to another because they're foreclosing on their house and they're becoming a tenant. And I was in the mortgage world, and I'd seen all these mortgages go down in price, this subprime crisis, and we're buying them at discount prices. And I was noticing how cheap the homes were selling. And I was like, this is crazy. So we went out and looked at all these areas and found out homes are really trading at too low a price. And it went from, really what happened was all of our home prices are based on a mortgage. And if you take that mortgage away, imagine if you had to pay 100% in cash. The price would be a lot lower. We don't really have the full amount of cash to buy homes. So we said, we need to come and help this. And there's a way that's going to happen. First is people like 510 are going to come in and buy the homes, renovate them, lease them to these people, and provide kind of a nice place to live, provide jobs. Like it's funny, we across the country employ more than 1,000 people helping renovate and lease these homes. And then providing a stable neighborhood. The neighborhoods look better. It used to be that the rental house was the ugly one around. It's funny now, if you drive through some of the California cities that had a lot of foreclosures, you can see the rental house because it has green grass, right? The places that were foreclosed all were dying. So we acquire homes, renovate, and lease across the country. These are the areas that we're in, and one of the interesting things is when you look at this, you'll see that a lot of them are in decent populations. We don't invest in Detroit. We're just going into Pittsburgh, which is an interesting one. And when I go out and try to raise money, people like pretty homes. The people I'm talking to, they don't really relate with areas of populations going down. In fact, when I go in and say, hey, it's just a stable neighborhood. It's a neighborhood that people need. It's just a transition. The investors are so used to, I want to know where growth is. I want to know where people are moving. And that's where the capital goes. So I've kind of brought it a little bit further back where we're investing in kind of just stable, not growing neighborhoods. But capital definitely avoids areas of decline right now. This is an interesting thing about just home ownership. If you look at the home ownership rate going down, there's going to be about $2 trillion worth of homes that go to rental. It's a fascinating number. The other thing is household formation has been fairly stable, but this is the building. So we've been underbuilding across the country for the last 3 or 4 years by a lot more than we overbuilt in the early 2000s. And this is some work also just to look at affordability. We all heard about and have witnessed the housing bubble. When we look at affordability and we say, for the last 50 years, the median household price was 3.5 times median household income. And it was the mortgage market that kept that in line. When the mortgage market kind of relaxed their constraints, it got up to 5.5 times. It's just really kind of fallen back to where it normally is, but we focus on areas that are really trading at 2 times and try to bring capital to get those prices back to a more normal level. This is very small. But these are all the cities that we look at. And the thing that I wanted to look at is some of these areas up at the top, Detroit, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, are the places where you have these populations declining. And the interesting thing is you can buy the median house price. I've ranked this by this ratio of the nation's 3.5 times. Detroit, you can buy a foreclosed home at less than what the median household income is in the area, at 70%. Literally, you could take 1 year's income and own a house. It seems like a great investment, but obviously you don't need so many homes. I would love to bring capital to these areas. One of the things that you've heard, Blackstone, Colony, even places like 510, we're all growing and we're bringing capital to rental. These people are focusing on even higher price homes than we are. Like they're buying $200,000, $300,000 homes. But I'll tell you what, when the mortgage market comes back, all of those investments are going to go back to homeowners because homeowners will be a more efficient ownership. And the great thing that I hope happens is that all that capital moves into long-term renters and moves into the urban areas where you can't get a mortgage and capital's needed. And they've actually become very good landlords. There's some articles that I think are unfair. I think so far they've been really focused on the right thing. I think that's pretty much what I'll cover for now. Thanks.
Can you get rid of the JavaScript Debugger? Does anybody know what that is? I got it. Okay. Thank you, Rob. To me, it's fascinating. I know it's what makes it happen, but I still don't fully understand it. Being trained as an architect and urban planner, and it's new territory for me and for many of us. So it's exciting to hear and to see the physical manifestation of that in our built environment. I'd like to pose a few questions to the panel, have a discussion here, and then open it up to the audience for further questions. Could we not stay on the capital markets and role of government in these? And I'd like to open this up, but we could start with Miliana or Phil or others who would like to address this issue in broader terms, or give other specific examples of, how can we further enhance our work through helping guide the role of government, for example, or attracting. Rob started to get at this, attracting capital to areas of higher vulnerability.
I'll start. I was mentioning before the panel that we've seen different markets are very different in terms of the private sector involvement in the public sector. And so part of the reason the scattered site works in New Orleans is it's pretty easy to acquire blighted properties. They've made that pretty easy. You buy it for cheap and you can do something with it, and that makes your money go further. We've also looked at markets in Trenton where the city will just hold on to blighted properties and won't let them go. So, for example, I gave the example of this beautiful library that was built during the Civil War, and it's just empty and abandoned on a beautiful block, and they won't give it up. And these are nonprofits looking to redevelop it. This isn't, trying to make like a strip mall on this block or anything like that. So I would say what we usually do is we try to fill that void that the public sector can't do in a market. So we could be bridge financing if the public sector will come in later. So that's a role that we can tangibly play. But if we can't get access to these units and these properties, there's not much that we can do. And so from a policy question, it's how do we get access to it?
Just talking at a slightly loftier plane, I would draw attention to the incredible shift in policy in the United States that has favored certain coastal cities like San Francisco, New York, my own Washington, D.C., and disadvantaged other cities like, say, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, right? So, for example, I could fly here yesterday from Washington, D.C. for $154, right? But if I wanted to fly from Washington to Pittsburgh, which is about a 4 to 5 hour drive, right? Pittsburgh is in the grip of a airline monopoly, so it would probably cost me $400 to go to Pittsburgh, right? If I want to go to Salt Lake City, or Salt Lake City or New Orleans or St. Louis, same difference, right? Throughout most of American history, we have had policies that made it were very self-consciously directed at equalizing economic development across the continent. Right? When we had the railroads, we had the Interstate Commerce Commission that made sure that the cost of taking the train to St. Louis was not out of proportion to the cost of taking it to San Francisco. So the monopolization of transportation and of many other things that in our economy has really worked to the disadvantage of a lot of these inland cities. And it's, I think, a new issue that people should think about.
Absolutely. Okay. I think that what you're doing, Nina, as well, in terms of both the research and and pilot projects and integrating this into the academic realm, starts to form the foundation, in part, to begin to have support to change policy. And I'm hoping that that's some of what's going to come out of this project and our work as well.
One thing I can mention again, when you teach so many international students, the context can I first have to sort of get them familiar with our context. But one of the things I've learned, again, from them, in many of the places they live, renovation is not even considered. So the project that we're working on in this small neighborhood about 3 miles from the campus, where, again, it's lost more than half its population, I've got students that have never seen wood frame construction, and they're pretty good at understanding, okay, so how does that work? But the idea of renovation and how you renovate, or even what insulation is, because it's not on the market in many hot, humid countries, all these ideas are so very different. So introducing the ideas and the opportunities that this allows to introduce students to the idea that you can renovate, that it does make a difference, that embodied energy in buildings is really valuable, and that there are products and ways to renovate as opposed to demolish buildings. Those things matter, and Pittsburgh is a city where I think the Urban Redevelopment Authority is supporting renovation in many ways, although that is not something that I specialize in a great deal. So,
that's great. Let's touch on the environmental issue and what any of you have seen on this. And Rob, you also might think that, well, maybe that's not what I do, but I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, what you're seeing on kind of environmental impact. And the issue of where one panelist or Nina presented, this might be an opportunity, shrinking city, decrease in population, for the city to take an environmental breath, if you will, and to rethink the systems. Others say that a urbanizing world is a more sustainable world, and we'll use Manhattan or density factor to make that case. So I'd be curious to hear, frankly, from each one of you very quickly what you think about either of those two things. And it's probably it's not a black and white answer necessarily, but which you think is more sustainable. Anybody can start.
Well, I think I showed my my sort of inclinations, but I think although we believe we can engineer almost anything, there are places where we've completely overwhelmed the natural environment. Singapore, for example, is a good example of a place where they've been very creative in how they handle their water system, but it's a tap to tap. It's a completely closed cycle. So you use it, it goes into a treatment system, it's completely treated, and it comes back to your tap. There's no natural hydrologic cycle able to be used. So and what we're doing to the air and particulate levels and the impact that will have on health is really distressing to me. So I would say that this assumption that megacities are great, we can engineer a lot of things, and there may be some apparent efficiencies in lower energy use per square foot, but we do live in an environment, and I think the thought that we can completely overwhelm it and engineer for our own purposes without thinking about everything else that is supposed to or used to live there is a mistake. And if you look at studies in psychology and all those kinds of things, when you crowd species too much, they do feel stress. And so I tend to think that that's probably a mistake. And if we might think about a future where we distribute ourselves more widely, our electronic communications allow us to work so that we don't always have to be in a specific workplace. And maybe if we think about how ecosystems look at the resources there and try to maybe develop a density that's appropriate for the resources, that might be a better way to develop.
Well, I think the relationship between population and the environment is a very complex one, and I'll give you two examples. One is from your hometown, Pittsburgh. I just happen to know because I did some work on it. So the population of people in Pittsburgh is just a fraction of what it was in the 1950s. The population of automobiles is several-fold more than in the 1950s, right? And I haven't actually done this calculation for Detroit, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's more autos in Detroit today than there were in 1950 because of the remaining people there, right? They have 2-3 cars, right? So at a larger scale, if we look at, say, all of China, right? All of China went from a population in which the average woman had 5 kids to one which had 1 in a single generation, right? And what happened to per capita carbon emission? Well, it's almost as if by having fewer children, each one of those kids consumed that much more right? And so that really is the pattern so far in the world, is where we see the falling fertility rates. What has happened at the same time is all the remaining adults have said, there's just more for us, right? And so more consumption has gone up, right, even on a per capita basis. So anyway, those are two cautionary notes about people who say, oh, this is just great, right? Fewer people, the planet will love us. It's like not necessarily true.
And I'll just add to Nina's point, I think in these shrinking populations, these cities with shrinking populations, there's a bit of intentionality about how to use the space. So, in New Orleans, that Myrtle Banks project that I showed, there's intentionally 8,000 square feet of green space there, because they can afford it. I mean, this is not a, high-cost real estate market. You can choose to put that there. And it's for various reasons. It's a community amenity. It draws people to the site. There's obviously, externalities in terms of getting people to go there. But I think there is a bit of that intentionality around how do we design this so it is more pleasant, whether it's, preserving natural resources or being greener, or if it's for environmental or sustainability, whatever the reason is, they have the flexibility to work with that.
Maybe I'll go a slightly different angle. Every city that I've gone to look to invest in seems to have a mini Detroit in it. And that's something I just wasn't aware of. Like, I go visit Milwaukee or something. I usually go to some nice place. I don't usually drive around and see where you can buy foreclosed homes. And it's a pretty basic principle that you guys are probably all familiar with, is money kind of moved out through rings. And when you buy homes, you can see an age. Like, all right, here's all the 1920s homes are kind of urban. Then the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s home, kind of one ring around the city. And then you get kind of the 90s and 2000s around that. And now we kind of have this shift where a lot of the money's going back into the city itself. So it used to be that the mini Detroit was urban. Now it's becoming kind of this first ring around cities. And this is kind of an interesting one where people are moving into the city, don't really care about these 1960s homes. And I watch it, and it's pretty apparent when you're there. You can see this, in the next 10 years, this is all going to be boarded up. And I don't know much about it. You guys probably have more experience, but it's got to be some kind of planning around using these homes and doing something, because it's apparent this is going to be a problem across nearly every city that I've been to.
That's the way almost every city in the world is, except in North America, right? The suburbs are where all the poor people live. Right. The inner cities where rich people live.
Yeah, I think we just got a new charge from Rob, and I'm definitely willing to embrace it. I hope we can together. Do we have just another question or two, and then I want to open it up to those of you in the audience. Do you think we can or should design for decline, or, as we discussed before, contraction? Can we build flexible cities so that we're not facing this in 2100 when population stabilizes, or perhaps we depopulate again in a wave? Does it make sense? Or should we keep going the way we've kind of always, taking the short-term view? And can we do a low-road city? Should we?
Well, I guess, we have these cities that we've been talking about, like Detroit, right, or New Orleans, where something really bad has happened, right? And as a consequence of that, they're depopulating, right? But the larger picture, though, in the world, and even in North America, is we're becoming more urban. Certain cities are growing and becoming more dense and richer relative to the rest of the world. And so even as population declines in a country or ultimately in the globe, right, we have this incredible increasing density. So in some ways, that's the big issue most of the time, with exceptions like Detroit, right? And then my favorite example of this is Russia, where Russia is a country that is losing 600,000 people a year in absolute population, right? Just more deaths than births. And yet the population of Moscow in the last 15 years has gone from something about 7 million to some people think it might be 18 million. And I was there recently. People are driving on the sidewalks in Moscow. It looks like Delhi, right? Because people, particularly young people in Russia, can't imagine any way to make a living in Russia except by moving to Moscow, right? And that's wrong, right? That's unsustainable. right? That's why we need this more balanced economic development across geographical space, in this case, a continent, right? And there's elements of that happening in the United States, too. It's just not as extreme as in Russia.
Thanks.
I can imagine our being able to design for change. That, and I think we think we're onto the right thing, and I like to think we're smarter than we used to be about this, so that if we design with modularity and flexibility in mind, so that, again, our infrastructure, perhaps our overbuilt infrastructure now, we sort of do zoned regeneration, and we think about how we can make it more flexible for the future. Again, there are people working on these ideas. I don't think it's an easy answer, and the money is always an issue when you're trying to regenerate things in places where there's a smaller and smaller tax base. But I do think that the idea of thinking about things being flexible and zoned in the future so it can grow, it can contract, and we don't have just enormous centralized systems that count on an enormous population, supporting them as one strategy to do it, and the kinds of things that Prudential is showing, where it's walkable, workable communities. It's certainly very appealing, and it seems to me like that would have some mileage in the future.
It's great. I think we have the dream team here to make that happen. So thank you. I want to open it up to the audience to see if you have any questions on the topic. We have about 10 minutes left. So just in the back. Oh, okay.
Hi, my name is Olivia Start. I work in government affairs and policy for the American Planning Association. I just want to say this is a great panel. It's really interesting. One of the things that we're actually really interested in is capital ventures in suburbs, buying up some of the foreclosed homes and making them rental properties, thinking about the character of neighborhoods, thinking about delivery of services, and some of the programs that we put together for at-risk populations, moving those to the suburbs from inner cities is a challenge for planners and for cities in general. Have you given any thought to sort of long-term strategies for supporting populations that require more public services, and including transit, more social services, things like that? And also, you mentioned that when the mortgage market comes back, that these properties will turn back to owners. What happens if that doesn't happen? Is companies like yours, are you prepared to be long-term facility managers?
So the first one I've thought of, but as a businessman, it'd be a luxury to think of, but it hasn't really come into play in our business plan. The second one, absolutely. I think there's the good thing about what's happening in the foreclosure market as far as capital is very large national scalable rental companies are being formed, and they're going to bring institutional capital to the future rental market. And the future rental market is the lower income. The higher income homes they're buying right now, I truly believe they're going to go back to home ownership. And I was involved in the beginning of the mortgage-backed securities market in the 80s. The efficiency that mortgages bring to our country and house prices and home ownership, also the stability. If the mortgage market constrains purchases and lending to affordability, is outstanding. So yes, I think it's coming back. I think it's going to come back in a more conservative fashion, and I think it's going to be definitely going down to kind of middle income people. I think it's going to stop and not go to lower income people. So lower income people are not going to have access, in my opinion, and they're going to be renters. And a lot of this capital and infrastructure is being built to invest in homes will move that direction over the coming 5 to 10 years.
Great. Thank you, Rob.
If I can just add quickly, we are in one program that we invested in that does blend that social service. So if you're familiar, the FHA has been auctioning off non-performing mortgages, and so there are these community stabilization pools that are actually not for flipping or whatnot. It's really to kind of work with homeowners with the goal of permanently reducing their mortgage to more in line with the value. And what the program we're involved with does is they try to separate out loan servicing with kind of that counseling. And so they work with these local resolution specialists who will work with the homeowner to have a budget, to have a financial plan, to kind of work through that. Because what you realize is when somebody is behind on mortgage payments, how emotional of a process that is. You're in denial about it. You don't want to deal with it. You don't want to face it, and how much you need that high touch relationship. And so I think we're increasingly recognizing that money is so much, but to really have effect, especially with low to middle income populations, you really need that high touch engagement.
Great, thank you, Miliana. Thanks for the question, Olivia. We had a question in the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering with the discussion around foreclosures, and we have here in the Bay Area, I think with San Francisco and as well looking across the bridge in the East Bay with Oakland, quite some examples of foreclosures happening and rental companies moving in, buying up houses, developing them, and then renting them out as several units to middle income, maybe families or single owners. And there's a whole big discussion around that, which involves pushing the initial community out of those areas, the whole trend around gentrification. And I was wondering if there are any thoughts around that as well, especially if we speak about, if this is a conference, Architecture for Humanity, we talk about building for community, enabling communities. Is there any thought around how can such processes be more sustainable or actually more inclusive of the original community rather than pushing people out and forcing low-income communities to find their home somewhere else? Yeah.
So I can speak to that briefly. The same program that I brought up, we run into that challenge all the time in terms of who our co-investors are. So we're an impact investor. We want there to be social outcomes. We want there to be affordable housing. We want to preserve that. You might have an equity investor in there who does not think the same, and that's a constant struggle that we have. And trust me, we've papered it up legally as best as we can. Probably the best way to do it is if there's a government mandate. So a lot of these programs, HUD or the FHA will have requirements on what that outcome is for a home. So it could be permanently reducing the mortgage. It could be renting it out to a low-income tenant. I think that's probably one of few ways to get to that, because if at the end of the day, it's whoever invested in is going to make that decision. And there are also some good nonprofit partners who are very experienced in development. We work with one in New Jersey specifically that's what they do for a living. And it really just depends on aligning incentives. And, there's perfectly good reasons from a for-profit perspective to do it. There are other community stabilization incentives, and it just depends who you partner with.
I struggle with that issue. And a lot of the larger real estate institutional investors are doing exactly that. They're going into the urban area, and they're buying up properties or building something, and they're bringing higher income, wealthier people in, and they call it value add, right? That's what they're calling it as an investor, but it's really just they're taking something that rented for $1,000 and all of a sudden it's renting for $2,000 or $3,000 with some additional investment. We specifically have avoided that. We're going in, and our goal as a company was simply to provide stability in a neighborhood where instead of forcing someone to move into an apartment somewhere, we literally buy the house near where they're being foreclosed, and our tenants move less than a block away. So our rent, our home price, everything's based, if you saw that affordability, is based on the neighborhood's income. We want to get back to where the neighborhood is priced accurately, priced affordably, and has a stable kind of nature to it. And we feel like, right now foreclosure pricing is such that we can bring capital in to do that.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. We have about 3 minutes left. Never fear, though, after the session, the panelists will be in the back room, and we can have a lively discussion continued there.
My name is Charlene Sakamoto. I'm a student of interior architecture and design. I wanted to ask, I was hoping that you guys would address a solution to the shrinking population in the cities. If more people are moving from the suburban areas to the bigger cities, like, is there hope for the suburban areas instead of like just taking over, you know, the area and like renting out the homes or something, for example? Like, I see a lot of businesses that like a lot of vacant buildings in like the suburban areas, and I just think that, you know, I was hoping like there would be some hope behind it. So I don't know if you guys could talk about that.
Well, one thing that's kind of, you said more people are moving out of the suburbs into the inner city. Actually, even in this city, as affluent as it is, there's a net migration is out of San Francisco, which is unbelievable if you think about it, because throughout all of history, right, where have people moved? They've moved towards opportunity, right? Now we're having the great migration flows are away from opportunity. And why is that happening, right? Well, some people say it's all your guys' fault, right? You're not making the right kind of real estate, right? There's not enough mixed-use development, and you know there's too much exclusionary zoning and other things like that. And you know there's an element of truth to that. But the other big picture thing is that the wages of working class people have gone down relative to the wages of all other kinds of people. So working class people who might have once lived in this area can't afford this area anymore. And that may be the thing to concentrate. Like I read recently that San Francisco is facing this building boom that's going on. All the finances is lined up. Everything's in place, you know, for this new cycle of building boom, except one problem, not enough construction workers, right? Right? Because they had to move out of the city. They live in Stockton someplace now, right? And they can't get in. Well, it never seems to occur to anybody that maybe you could raise the wages of construction workers, right? That would be a solution to the problem instead of like trying to Jimmy mortgage markets or zoning or something like this, right? So anyway.
I'll just add so personal experience, like I work in Newark, New Jersey, and the first time I think I went to New York was my job interview. And I walked there, but I live in Brooklyn, so I live 2 rivers away. I commute an hour to work. Why don't I live in Newark? You know, so it's kind of basic, and I feel like it's not safe there yet. I can't buy an apple. I can't I can't go to a cool restaurant. You know, and there are pockets of activity, but it's still very limited. And I think some of the challenges in these cities, whether they're shrinking, they're shrunk, they've, you know, experienced some decline over the years, it's a lot of individual people's reactions to what is going on. And I think, you know, that kind of came full circle for me when I realized, like, I don't need to live in a rich area or it doesn't have to be trendy. I'm not attached to a name, but I need an apple from time to time. And so I think a lot of the work that we have been trying to do, and I think a lot of people are trying to do, is increasing transit-oriented infrastructure, increasing access to fresh food, creating that lifestyle there where you feel like on a weekend or after work, you would be happy in your home and you wouldn't just go home to watch, Dancing with Stars. So that's just my take. I'm not an urban planner, so I can't speak to that. But to me, it was like a very real life example.
Last comment?
Well, I think there are, when you say solutions, I think there are people that are trying to make things better. The project that we're working on in this small community called Hazelwood, our NGO, it's called Action Housing. They're actively seeking out the food bank to go into an old abandoned grocery store, to provide a grocery store in a neighborhood that's called a food desert. This would not and this is happening all over the place. Chicago and New York have been doing a lot with urban gardening, and they've got mobile trucks. In Chicago, there's a bus that was donated, and it's a mobile green grocer that goes around to neighborhoods that are food deserts. There are people with good intention and vision that are doing these things, but I don't think the market necessarily automatically does it. I think that if you have a vision of something better, if that's what's inside you, part of what you need to be doing is participating in making things better. And I think that's going on. So it's more a matter, I think, of seeking it out, joining people who are doing it, and lending that vision and that energy to those efforts.
Thank you. That's a great place to close. We are doing it, Yes. The project that Nina was referring to in Chicago is Fresh Moves, which is a AFH chapter project there. And you can start in the small scale, and it builds up. So it's very exciting to have the doers and the makers here and to respond to these challenges. I want to make a quick correction on where to find information on Nina and other work that we're doing with Alcoa and the university's website is pillarsofsustainableeducation.org. But we'll have a link on the site, our website as well. I want to thank Nina, Phil, Miliana, and Rob for a very stimulating conversation. This is just the beginning of a discussion that I hope we all who are trained differently will take on and hope that we'll be able to engage in the future with you all and your colleagues on this topic. And invite you all to join us just outside here at the round table if you have further questions for a short discussion with the panelists. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.